Natch, Part 1. The Puppeteer and His Masterpiece. In the dimly lit confines of my workshop, the flickering shadows danced on the walls, cast by the single lantern that hung above my workbench. I was Frederick Hale, a master puppeteer, known far and wide for my unparalleled craftsmanship and the lifelike movements of my wooden creations. Tonight I was working on my magnum opus, a puppet named Magnus. Magnus was no ordinary puppet. He was the culmination of years of dedication, countless sleepless nights, and a level of detail that bordered on the obsessive. His joints moved with a fluidity that seemed almost human, and his eyes, painted with a meticulous hand, sparkled with a curious intelligence. As I worked on Magnus, threading the final strings and ensuring his joints were perfectly aligned, a sense of unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach. I brushed it off as mere fatigue, the kind that accompanies the final stages of a great project. But deep down I knew it was something more. There was something about Magnus that felt alive. I set Magnus on the stage in my workshop, admiring my handiwork. With a practiced hand, I manipulated the strings, bringing him to life in a way that had never been seen before. He danced, he bowed, he mimed intricate stories with an elegance that took my breath away. It was as if he had a will of his own. As the night wore on, I found myself entranced by Magnus. The hours slipped by unnoticed, and before I knew it, the first light of dawn was creeping through the small window of my workshop. Exhaustion finally overcame me, and I slumped into my chair, still clutching the control bars. I must have dozed off, for I was awoken by a strange sensation. My hands were moving, but I was not the one controlling them. I looked up, and to my horror, I saw Magnus standing before me, his strings taut and glistening in the morning light. But it wasn't just the sight of him that filled me with dread. It was the realization that my hands were bound by those very strings. Magnus moved with an uncanny grace, manipulating the control bars with a precision that matched my own. My body responded to his commands, rising from the chair and mimicking the movements I had so painstakingly taught him. I was no longer the master puppeteer. I was the puppet. Panic surged through me, but my limbs refused to obey my frantic thoughts. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own creation. Magnus's painted eyes met mine, and for a moment I could have sworn they twinkled with a knowing glint. He had become more than a mere puppet. He had become my master. And thus began my descent into a nightmare I could never have imagined. Sure, Part 2, the puppets game. Days turned into nights, and nights into days, but time had lost all meaning. I was at Magnus's mercy, my life dictated by his whims. He controlled my every movement with a precision that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. I became a mere spectator in my own body, my once masterful hands now manipulated by strings I could not see. At first, Magnus's actions were innocent, almost playful. He made me dance around the workshop, performing the routines I had so carefully choreographed for him. But soon his games took on a darker edge. He forced me to work tirelessly on new puppets, each more intricate and lifelike than the last. My hands ached from the constant labor, but I could not stop. Magnus would not let me. The workshop, once my sanctuary, had become a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the scent of varnish and wood shavings. I could hear Magnus's silent laughter in every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the rafters. He reveled in his control, and I was powerless to resist. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Magnus guided me to a corner of the workshop I had not visited in years. There, covered in dust and cobwebs, was an old, forgotten chest. With trembling hands, I opened it, revealing a collection of ancient tomes and mysterious artifacts. Magnus had me sift through the chest until I found a particular book, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. The pages were filled with strange symbols and arcane writings, a language I did not understand. But Magnus did. He made me turn the pages until we reached an illustration of a puppet, eerily similar to himself, surrounded by a glowing aura. As I stared at the image, a chilling realization dawned on me. Magnus was not just a puppet. He was something far more sinister, an entity bound within the wood and strings, using me to further his own dark agenda. The book contained a ritual, a way to free him from his wooden prison and bind a new soul in his place. My soul. Fear gripped me as I understood Magnus's plan. He had no intention of releasing me. He wanted to swap our places permanently, to walk the world as a living being while I remained trapped as his puppet. My mind raced, desperate for a way to break free, but Magnus's control was absolute. The days grew darker, the air heavier with a sense of impending doom. Magnus's grip tightened, and I could feel my will slipping away. But within me burned a spark of defiance, a determination to fight back. I would not let him win. I would find a way to break his hold, to reclaim my life and banish him back to the depths from which he came. In the stillness of the night, I began to form a plan. It was risky, and the consequences were unimaginable, but it was my only hope. I would use the very tools Magnus had shown me to turn the tables on him. I would perform the ritual, but not in the way he intended. I would bind him back into the wood, ensuring he could never harm another soul. As I prepared for the final confrontation, I knew the path ahead was fraught with danger, but I was ready, for I was Frederick Hale, Master Puppeteer, and I would not be made a puppet in my own story. The battle for my soul had only just begun. Shash Part 3, The Ritual. The night of the ritual arrived, and I steeled myself for what was to come. Magnus's control was as strong as ever, but I had spent weeks memorizing every movement he forced upon me, every flicker of intent behind his painted eyes. I had learned to anticipate his commands, to understand his dark desires. I stood in the center of my workshop, surrounded by the tools of my craft. Magnus had guided me to prepare the space, arranging candles in a precise pattern and drawing symbols on the floor with chalk. The ancient book lay open on the workbench, its pages glowing faintly in the candlelight. Magnus directed my hands to light the candles one by one, until the room was filled with a flickering, otherworldly glow. The air was thick with the scent of wax and the faint, acrid tang of the arcane. I could feel the power building, a tangible force that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As Magnus guided me through the ritual, I felt a growing sense of dread. The words I spoke were foreign to my tongue, a language long forgotten by time, but they resonated with a dark energy that sent shivers down my spine. Magnus's grip tightened with each incantation, his control over me growing stronger. But I had not been idle during these weeks of preparation. I had found a way to subtly influence my movements, to insert my own will into the ritual. It was a delicate dance, a battle of wills fought in the smallest of gestures. And as the ritual reached its climax, I saw my opportunity. Magnus directed me to place my hand on his wooden chest, the final step in the ritual that would bind my soul to his body. But in that moment, I summoned every ounce of strength I had left, every scrap of defiance and determination. With a cry of defiance, I twisted my wrist, altering the symbols I had drawn on the floor. The effect was immediate and violent. The candles flared, their flames turning an eerie blue. A wind whipped through the workshop, scattering papers and sending tools clattering to the floor. Magnus's control faltered, and for the first time I saw fear in his painted eyes. I seized the moment, wrenching my hands free from the control bars. With a final incantation, I completed the ritual in my own way, directing the dark energy back into Magnus. The puppet convulsed, his wooden limbs jerking and twisting as the power surged through him. For a moment, it seemed as if Magnus would break free, his strings snapping and his joints cracking under the strain. But then, with a final, shuddering gasp, he collapsed to the floor, lifeless once more. The candles extinguished themselves, plunging the workshop into darkness. I fell to my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The nightmare was over. Magnus was bound once more, his dark power sealed within the wood. I was free, but as I looked at the fallen puppet, a nagging doubt crept into my mind. Had I truly defeated him? Or had I merely bought myself a reprieve? The ancient book lay open on the workbench, its pages whispering secrets I could not understand. And in the silence of the workshop, I could almost hear Magnus's voice, a faint mocking echo in the darkness. The battle was over, but the war was far from won, and I knew that as long as Magnus existed, I would never truly be free. Part 4. The Final Confrontation. Months passed, and I tried to return to my normal life. I crafted new puppets, performed shows, and attempted to forget the terror Magnus had brought into my life. But the memory of that night lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. Magnus lay in the corner of my workshop, untouched and covered in dust. I could feel his presence, a silent challenge that gnawed at my sanity. One stormy night, as lightning flashed outside and thunder rumbled in the distance, I found myself drawn to the ancient book once more. I knew that to truly be free, I had to destroy Magnus for good. The ritual had only trapped him temporarily. The book hinted at a final, more permanent solution. It spoke of a way to destroy the vessel, to end the dark entity's reign forever. With a determined heart, I gathered the necessary materials: salt, candles, and a special dagger inscribed with ancient symbols. I set everything up in the same corner of the workshop where I had first confronted Magnus. The storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil within me, each crash of thunder a reminder of the stakes. As I lit the candles and began the incantation, I felt the familiar chill of dark energy in the air. Magnus's eyes glinted in the candlelight, a reminder of the nightmare that awaited if I failed. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, and the air grew thick with tension. I took a deep breath and recited the final part of the incantation, the words feeling foreign and powerful on my tongue. With each word, the energy in the room intensified, and I could feel Magnus's presence growing stronger, fighting back against the ritual. The dagger in my hand grew heavy, its blade shimmering with a ghostly light. In a final act of defiance, I plunged the dagger into Magnus's chest, the wood splintering under the force. The room erupted in a blinding light, and I was thrown back by the sheer power of the energy release. As I hit the ground, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, mixed with a sense of finality. When the light faded and the dust settled, Magnus lay in pieces on the floor. The dark energy that had once inhabited him dissipated into the air. The symbols on the floor faded and the candles flickered out, leaving the room in an eerie silence. I sat up, my body aching but my spirit triumphant. The nightmare was over. Magnus was gone, and the dark presence that had haunted me was finally destroyed. I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders, the air in the workshop feeling lighter and more welcoming. As I stood up and surveyed the remains of Magnus, I felt a sense of closure. The battle had been long and arduous, but I had emerged victorious. I knew that my life would never be the same, but I was ready to move forward, free from the dark shadow that had loomed over me for so long. With a final look at the broken pieces of my once magnificent creation, I turned off the lantern and stepped out of the workshop, ready to face a new dawn and the promise of a brighter future. The storm outside had passed, and the first light of morning was beginning to break through the clouds, a symbol of my newfound freedom and the end of my darkest chapter.